The first thing I saw when I stepped outside that morning was the bright yellow HOA violation notice attached to my barn entrance. It flapped in the breeze like a warning poster, shouting at me before I even got close. Enough to read the term Eyesore violation. Non-compliance construction, immediate action needed. I let out a gentle whistle. They'd finally achieved it after months of passive, aggressive letters and committee meetings where I was the main focus of discussion. The HOA had finally raised their war against my barn. Margaret Henshaw, the self-appointed leader of our neighborhood, had made it her goal to enhance the community by eliminating anything that didn't fit her perfect little vision, and my old sturdy family-made barn was her latest target. I could already hear her tone in my head, sharp and smug. "We have standards, Mr. Henderson, and your barn simply does not align with the neighborhood's aesthetic values." Translation: it wasn't beige white or some other dull shade. That made everything blend into a boring landscape of matching homes. I snatched the notice off the entrance and read the tiny print. According to the new HOA regulations, any construction deemed disruptive to the visual balance of the neighborhood had to be either demolished or corrected within 30 days or face heavy daily penalties. A chuckle rose up my chest, not because I found this funny, but because of the sheer foolishness of it all. That barn had been here longer than most of these houses, longer than Margaret's trimmed hedges and her perfectly placed lawn gnomes, and yet somehow it was now the biggest threat to the neighborhood's well-being. I crushed the paper in my fist and turned just in time to see Margaret herself, flanked by 2 other board members, striding up my driveway like she was leading a squad into battle. She wore one of her classic pastel-colored suits, the kind that looked like it came straight out of a 50s fashion magazine. Her expression was as stiff as her press collar. "Good morning, Mr. Henderson," she said, her tone sugary and sweet, the kind of fake politeness that made my skin itch. "I doubt you actually wanted to have a good morning, Margaret," I said, waving the crumpled notice at her. "This yours?" She clasped her hands in front of her chest like a school teacher about to deliver a lesson. "The board has reviewed your property, and it's been decided that your barn does not meet our updated community guidelines. As stated in the letter, you'll need to repaint it in a more acceptable color or remove it altogether." I raised an eyebrow. "More suitable color?" She nodded. "Something neutral, perhaps a nice taupe or a soft gray." I glanced back at my barn, its faded red paint chipped in places, but still holding its rustic charm. My grandfather built that barn with his own 2 hands. It had stood through storms, brutal winters, and even a tornado that came through 10 years ago, but somehow Margaret thought a coat of taupe would be the thing to save it. I let out a deep sigh. "And if I don't," she smiled, but there was no warmth in it, "you'll be fined daily, and if the fines accumulate beyond a certain point, well, the HOA has the right to take further action." I knew what that meant: legal battles, possibly even a forced demolition order, all because someone thought my barn didn't match their perfect little vision of the neighborhood. For a moment, I considered just painting the thing the way they wanted. Maybe it wasn't worth the fight. Maybe I should just pick a dull color and move on. But then I looked at Margaret's smug expression, the way she was already seeing this as a victory, and something inside me snapped. "Oh, I'll repaint it all right," I said, grinning. For the first time that morning, Margaret's eyes lit up with approval. "I'm so glad you're willing to work with us," I nodded. "Absolutely. I'll make sure it's done by the end of the week." She left, satisfied that she had won, completely unaware of what was about to happen, because if they thought my barn was in eyesore before, they hadn't seen anything yet. The very next day, I went down to the hardware store and bought the most obnoxious, brightest shade of neon pink they had. Not just pink, this was the kind of pink that could be seen from space, the kind that would make flamingos jealous, the kind that would burn itself into Margaret's nightmares. It took 2 full days, a couple of 6-packs, and a little help from my buddy Gus, but by the time we were finished, my barn was a glowing beacon of defiance. It stood there, radiant and blinding under the sun, daring anyone to say a single thing about it. The reaction was immediate. I woke up the next morning to the sound of gasps shouts, and someone even dropping their coffee on the sidewalk. Neighbors stopped in their tracks, shielding their eyes. Like they were looking directly at the sun, kids pointed and laughed. And then like a bat out of hell, Margaret came speeding down my driveway. She stumbled out her car, eyes wide with horror. What have you done? I leaned against my newly pink barn, sipping my morning coffee. Like it was just another peaceful day. Oh, I followed the rules. I said, you said no red, you never said no pink. Margaret's face turned a shade that almost matched the barn. This is unacceptable. You cannot seriously think this is an improvement. I took a slow sip of my coffee, savoring the moment. You wanted harmony, Margaret. Nothing says harmony like a barn you can see from 3 streets over. She sputtered at a complete loss for words, which might have been the first time in history that had ever happened. And just like that, the war had begun. By the time the sun had fully risen the next morning, the entire neighborhood was buzzing about the pink barn. Some people loved it. Kids took selfies in front of it. A few teenagers made fun videos, pretending to be blinded by its glow, and even old Mrs. Donovan from 3 houses down walked by just a chuckle and shake her head. But not everyone was amused. The HOA board had gone into full-blown crisis mode, holding an emergency meeting on Margaret's lawn, all of them pacing, whispering, and waving papers around. Like generals preparing for battle, Margaret herself had been in front of my house 3 times already, each visit more dramatic than the last. First, she tried reasoning with me, her voice dripping with forced patience. Jack, I understand you think this is funny, but this is not a joke. The board expects immediate compliance. When that didn't work, she tried threats. This is a direct violation of community standard. You'll be fined every single day this remains standing. I shrugged and smiled through all of it, which only made her angrier. The official fine notice arrived by noon, $50 per day until I repainted or tore down the barn. Not exactly pocket change, but I've been expecting it. What they weren't expecting was the way the neighborhood reacted. The barn had become an attraction. It started with a few social media posts from the teenagers. Then, a couple of local bloggers picked up the story. Within 24 hours, I was getting messages from people in the next town over telling me they'd driven by just to see the now famous neon pink barn. Some guy even started selling t-shirts with a cartoon version of the barn and the words HOA approved printed underneath. The irony was in their attempt to make my barn disappear. The HOA had made it the most talked about thing in town. Margaret, of course, was losing her mind over it. That's when the dirty trick started. The first sign that they were escalating things came when I found a citation taped to my mailbox. Apparently, my lawn was suddenly out of compliance with HOA landscaping rules, never mind the fact that I'd had the same patch of grass, the same row of hedges, and the same exact flower beds for years. Now, according to the HOA, my hedges were excessively unkempt, and my mailbox was improperly maintained. I laughed and tossed the notice aside, but it didn't stop there. The next day, I woke up to a noise outside my house. When I stepped onto the porch, I saw a man in an official-looking vest walking around my property with a clipboard, muttering to himself. As he jotted things down, I walked up to him, coffee cup in hand. Can I help you with something? The man adjusted his glasses and gave me a polite but stiff smile. I'm with the county zoning board. I received a complaint about your barn. I sighed. Let me guess, Margaret sent you. I can't discuss the source of complaint, sir, but I do need to inspect the structure to ensure it meets all county regulations. I gestured toward the barn. Be my guest. He walked around, measured a few things, checked the foundation, and then after about 20 minutes, closed his folder and gave me a nod. Everything seems up to code. Nothing to report. Fantastic. Be sure to tell Margaret. His polite smile twitched, like he wanted to laugh, but knew better than to get involved. He just nodded again and left. By the third day, I'd received 3 more citations, including one accusing me of leaving my trash bins out too long after pickup day. I was almost impressed by the sheer pettiness of it. Almost. But I wasn't about to let them win. If They wanted to play dirty. I was more than happy to return the favor. That's when Gus called me. I found something, he said, the moment I picked up something big. Gus, being the brilliant former lawyer that he was, had been digging through public records and HOA documents in his spare time, and what he'd found was enough to make me sit up straight. Margaret has a real estate business, he explained. She's been buying properties in the neighborhood, but only after forcing homeowners to comply with HOA rules that end up driving down their property values. Then she flips them for a massive profit. I whistled. So that's what all of this is about. Looks like it, Gus confirmed. She's been trying to make the neighborhood visually uniform to attract high-end buyers. Your barn, being the bright pink thorn in her side, is messing up her sales pitch. It all made sense now. This wasn't just about HOA rules. This was about money. Margaret wasn't trying to preserve the beauty of the neighborhood. She was trying to manipulate property values for her own gain, and I had just become her biggest obstacle. That night I sat on my porch, looking at the barn, glowing under the moonlight, and realized I had two choices. I could keep fighting these petty fines, dealing with the daily harassment, and eventually maybe they wore me down, or I could fight back in a way that Margaret would never see coming. The next morning I made some calls. If Margaret wanted to play the long game, I was going to make sure it backfired spectacularly. By the end of the day, I had a plan, and it was going to be the most satisfying thing I'd ever done. The morning of the HOA's next meeting, I had everything ready. The barn, still proudly neon pink, stood as a beacon of defiance, but today it was more than just a middle finger to Margaret and her rules. Today it was a symbol of something bigger. The fight wasn't just about my barn anymore. It was about every homeowner in the neighborhood who had been bullied, fined, and threatened into submission. Margaret had been playing this game for years, and I was about to be the one to flip the board. The meeting was held in the community center, a soulless beige building that perfectly matched Margaret's idea of beauty. When I arrived, the place was packed. Normally, these meetings barely attracted a handful of people, but tonight word had spread. Homeowners who never cared about HOA politics before were here, whispering among themselves, some shooting me encouraging nods as I walked in. Margaret stood at the front, flanked by her loyal board members, her usual smug confidence radiating off her like cheap perfume. She spotted me, and her lips curled into a forced smile. "Mr. Henderson," she said, her voice dripping with fake politeness. "How nice of you to finally take an interest in community matters. I've been interested for a while," I said, taking a seat near the front. Just never had a reason to come until now. Margaret cleared her throat and straightened a stack of papers. "Let's begin. We have several important matters to discuss this evening, including ongoing violations that need immediate attention." Her eyes flickered toward me for just a second before she continued. "First, let's address the issue of non-compliance structures." Before she could finish, Gus stood up from the back of the room. "Actually, before we get into that, I have some business to bring up." He held up a thick manila folder. "I've been doing some digging, and I think the community deserves to know exactly what's been happening behind the scenes." Margaret's expression barely faltered, but I saw her fingers tighten around the papers in front of her. "This is highly irregular. You can't just interrupt." "Oh, I think he can," I said, leaning back in my chair, "especially when it's about something that affects every homeowner in this room." The murmurs started almost immediately, people shifting in their seats, eager to hear what was going on. Gus walked to the front, flipping open the folder. "I've looked into HOA property transactions over the last few years, and I found an interesting pattern. Homes that received multiple fines, often over ridiculous violations, were later sold, usually a loss. And guess who ended up buying them?" Margaret Henshaw. Gasps filled the room. Some people looked at each other in confusion, others in growing anger. Margaret's face remained calm, but I could see the stiffness in her posture. "This is absurd," she said, forcing a chuckle. "I've simply invested in properties like any smart business person would." "Sure," Gus continued, flipping through his documents, except these purchases happened suspiciously close to the times when new HOA rules were passed. Rules that made homeowners' lives miserable until they felt pressure to sell. And a kicker, Margaret would buy these homes at a bargain, make aesthetic improvements, and flip them for a hefty profit. The room erupted into noise. People started shouting over each other, some demanding answers, others just furious that they had been played. Margaret lifted a hand in an attempt to regain control. "Now hold on," she said. "You can't prove that I personally." "Oh, but we can," Gus interrupted, holding up a printed email. "These are messages between you and a real estate partner, discussing how to force a sale by making compliance unbearable. Care to explain that?" Margaret's face finally lost its composure. Her mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. But no words came out. She looked to the other board members, but they all suddenly seemed very interested in their paperwork, avoiding her gaze. That's when someone stood up from the audience. "You find me for having a flower pot on my porch," an older man shouted, pointing an accusing finger at Margaret. "You said it was not in line with community aesthetics. That was the beginning of the end for me." Another voice joined in. "You made me replace my perfectly fine fence because it was 2 inches too high. I spent thousands on a new one." More voices followed, each angrier than the last. Margaret's carefully crafted empire was crumbling in real time, and there was nothing she could do about it. She had spent years ruling this neighborhood with an iron fist, but now the people she had pushed around were finally pushing back. "I move for an immediate vote," a woman near the front called out. "Margaret Henshaw should be removed from the HOA board, effective immediately." The cheers and applause that followed were deafening. Margaret tried to protest, but no one was listening anymore. The board members, clearly wanting to distance themselves from the sinking ship, agreed without hesitation. The vote was taken on the spot, and just like that, Margaret was out. She stood there for a long moment, looking like a woman who had just lost everything. Then, without another word, she gathered her papers, turned on her heel, and stormed out of the building. No one stopped her. The room burst into celebration. People laughed. Some shook my hand, and a few even joked about repainting their own houses pink in my honor. The HOA board, now leaderless, agreed to roll back some of the more ridiculous rules, including the one about non-traditional colors. My barn could stay exactly as it was. The next morning, I walked outside with my coffee and took in the sight of my still vibrant neon pink barn. It stood there defiant and proud, a reminder that sometimes the little guy wins. And just for good measure, I decided to paint my mailbox pink too.